Well, now we will look to the basic behavior of the marginal cost and how it is related to the marginal productivity or marginal product. If you are familiar with math, you might already guessed it. The main point is while the marginal product is kind of inverse U-shaped or V-shaped, if you want to say it that way, um, marginal cost is U-shaped. I mean, the actual U-shaped, which means when you increase your production level, your marginal cost, the cost that is added by the additional unit, is decreasing at first. You got at some point to the minimum point, which means, minimum point, which means the marginal cost of adding this particular unit here is smaller than marginal cost of any other unit. And after that, marginal cost of adding additional units will start to increase. Why it is so? Well, easily you can see that we have for each worker we have, for example, we are paying $100. For this 40 units, for example, the marginal cost is 100 divided by 40, because by paying $100 to this additional worker, you are basically getting 40 units, so your marginal cost is 2.5 in this case. For this next 50 units before worked by the third worker, marginal cost is on average 100 divided by 50, which is 2. So marginal cost has decreased because you pay $100 and get 50 TVs in return. When we move to the fourth worker, the fourth worker is producing 40 TVs by getting $100. So marginal cost on average again become 2.5. And when you move to the fifth worker, marginal cost on average become 3.3. So marginal cost increases. Why it is increases? Because you pay same to the additional worker, but get less TV in return. Of course, in reality, for example, it might be very well be like, for example, for producing 100 airplanes but when we have a more structure where labor can be produced one by in smaller units than one, that might mean for producing the 5 TVs you need 2.5 units of labor. For producing 3 TVs you will need let's say 2.70 units of labor. And as you increase number of TVs you produce, at first amount of labor you need for additional TV will become smaller and smaller as productivity of workers increases. When you have more workers basically producing more TVs, and at some point the amount of labor you need will be the minimum, and after that amount of labor you will need for additional labor will increase, and since the cost is amount of labor times the cost you need for producing additional TV has a U-shaped, a shape of U, let's say. Okay, this is basically the story told that way. So now, using this basic information and some more trivial information you'll see, we will construct the overall cost structure of a typical company in the short run. So what are the cost structure they face, and how is this cost structure they face related to the quantity they produce? Basically, that's our interest. So 3 critical variables we will use is the average fixed cost, average variable cost, average total cost, in addition to the marginal cost, which we have already seen. And all of them are found by dividing the overall quantities like fixed cost, variable cost, and total cost to the quantity we produce. So fixed costs were constant. Basically, total fixed costs, they don't vary with they're not related to the quantity we produce. They stay constant however much we produce, which means average fixed costs are always decreasing when you produce more. If fixed cost is 1,000, for example, it is so when you produce 1 unit, and then you produce 1 unit. In that case, average fixed cost will be 1,000 over 1, which is 1,000. When you produce 10 units, in that case, average fixed cost is 1,000 units divided by 10. The fixed cost itself is the same, but you produce more. So the average fixed cost will be, in that case, 100. And when you produce 100 units, for example, it will be 10, because the fixed cost will be again the same, 1,000, but now you divide it to the 100. So average fixed cost is always decreasing when you produce more. Variable costs. Variable cost is basically sum of all marginal costs you produce. Total variable costs, I'm meaning that. Because if we produce 1 unit, the marginal cost of that 1 unit, well, the cost that is added by this 1 unit is the marginal cost of that unit. If you produce 2 units, the cost of the second unit is the cost added by the second unit. So the variable cost of the two units is the cost added by the first unit and cost added by the second unit. And in case of if you produce 3 units, then you also need to add the cost added by the 3 units. So for always, in order to calculate variable cost, you need to calculate marginal cost of all units separately, basically. For example, if I produce 2 units, in that case, my variable cost will be, total variable cost will be 180. I add 180. If I produce 3 units, then my total variable cost is 180 plus 60, which is 240. For 4 units, I also need to add 80 to these numbers, which will be 160, 220, 320, I believe. So this is how I calculate the variable costs. Of course, when I have a variable cost like this, in order to find average variable cost, I need to divide total variable cost to the quantity. For example, for 1 airplane, it is 100 divided by 1. For 2 airplanes, 180 divided by 2, which is 90. For 3 airplanes, it is 240 divided by 3, which is 80. And it goes like this. Okay, I think this is also very straightforward. Well, here you see an interesting relation, and that relation will be important for us. We won't see immediately at this point why it will be important, but in the next week's lecture we will see it. As you see, the average variable cost is not at its lowest point when the marginal cost is at its lowest point. Actually, here, when you see it, after the third unit, when you come to the fourth unit, the average variable cost remains the same. So, kind of between third and fourth unit, average variable cost is at its lowest point, while marginal cost is exactly at its lowest point at exactly 3 units. And after that, the average variable cost continues, starts to rise, and up to this point, the average variable cost is decreasing. So, however, when you draw the line, you see this. Average variable cost is at its lowest point when it intersects with the marginal cost. To be exact, actually, we should say this. Average variable cost is at its lowest point when it intersects with marginal cost curve, and at which point also marginal cost curve has an increasing slope, because the average variable cost and marginal cost curve can also intersect at the point when marginal cost has a decreasing slope. So basically, the point where average variable cost is minimum, at that point marginal cost should have a positive slope. But always the average variable cost is at minimum when it intersects with the marginal cost. Why is this way? Well, now think about this. Let's say we are producing 2 units. In that case, average variable cost is 90 and marginal cost is 80. Well, adding another unit, which is the third unit, will let's say we are producing 1 unit only, 100. Adding an additional unit of airplane in this case will add a cost which is equal to 80. Well, the second TV has a lower cost compared with the average variable cost, average cost per unit when we produce only 1 unit. So since it is relatively cheaper compared with the average, average cost per unit in our factory, it will decrease the average costs. Well, if you add, for example, to a classroom of students who got on average, let's say 3.0 as a grade, and if you add a student whose grade is lower than 3.0, it will decrease the average grade, basically. So when you increase, when you produce 90 units and adding third unit the third unit will increase cost by 60. Well, 60 is lower than the average cost, basically. So it will lower the cost. When adding the fourth unit will increase the cost exactly at the same amount, which is equal to the average cost, then in that case it won't have any effect on the cost. I mean, that's the case when the student you add to the classroom has exactly the same grade as the average grade. And when when you increase the quantity from 4 to 5, when adding another unit increases the cost more than the average variable cost. In that case, average variable cost will increase. That's the case when the new student have a higher grade. In that case, the average grade will move up. So, whenever marginal cost is lower than the average variable cost, it is pulling the average variable cost down. Whenever marginal cost is higher than the average variable cost, it is pulling again the average variable cost, in this case, up. It always pulls, like when you push, you are pushing something in opposite direction. You are on the left of someone, but you are pushing the person to the right. When you pull the someone, you are at the left and you are pulling it to the left. So marginal cost always pulls the average variable cost towards itself. If it is below, it is pulling it pulling it down. If it is above, it is pulling it up, basically. So, just like the average variable marginal cost, average variable cost, because of the behavior of the marginal cost, inevitably, it first moves down and then it moves up. And always, this is the shape of the average variable costs. Well, it doesn't necessarily start to move down, move up, get to the minimum point, starts to move up at the point when average variable cost starts to move up, because when the additional units you add have ever decreasing costs, average variable cost decrease slower because it also have the weight of the previous units you have add, which were more costlier in terms of marginal cost compared with the new units. So marginal cost will become inevitably, when it starts to move down, will be lower than the average variable costs. So when it starts to move up, initially it will still remain lower than the average variable cost, so it will still continue to pull the average variable cost down. But after the point when marginal cost exceeds the average variable cost. Now it will start to pull the average variable cost up. So average variable cost will have a U shape basically, shape.